Hey everyone, I'm just here to give a quick update on where I'm at with the contract Uzuri list. Now actually the Uzuri list that's been doing very well in terms of tournament results has a top 8 at a Battle Hardened as well as Chicago Brawl, which I believe is around the same size as a Battle Hardened, is a more redline style version of the deck. You play a much lower cost curve, you play more stealth cards, you don't play a whole lot of contract cards, and has the ability to pivot in between like 1 card hands and also can utilize up to 4 card hands, which is something that the contract list can't do. Personally for me, I think my reason for liking the contract list is mostly due to things like Mask of Perdition. If you look at the stat line on some of the contract cards, like we'll take a very easy one to hit, which would be Plunder the Poor. It's actually so easy to hit that the latest redline list, despite not really running contract cards, actually included this in the list because it's basically free silver. If you're able to block with Mask of Perdition and then on your turn send Plunder the Poor, and then break the mask and hit 2 triggers, so you get 2 silver, 2 contracts. The way you should analyze that is on that whole turn cycle, also including when you get the mask back, Plunder the Poor was essentially a 0 for 5. So I'm valuing silver at 0.5 because 2 silver gets you 1 block basically. So they get you 1 more point of health on armor. Now this of course becomes a lot worse in a faster game. So if your game is only 3 turns, then you might get 2 life out of your mask, but in a longer game, which this list can sort of force through disruptive hits as well as the concentration of 3 blocks and defensive tools, but you can make the stat lines in your cards very strong for the contracts. This also needs to take into consideration things like banishing cards from your opponent's deck do add up over time, and cards like Eradicate tied with a Pump can significantly reduce your opponent's deck, can wipe through either their second cycle pitch stack or can force them into their second cycle pitch stack much faster, and also blind ripping cards off the top can lead to some small variance, so it's not enough to really win you games, but sometimes when you do banish power cards off the top, that is enough to sort of push you into an end game where you're now pressuring the rest of their deck or their life total and you're able to sustain yours much better. This is especially relevant for things like Ranger, where not only can you present disruptive on hits that really threaten their core game plan, but due to their weakness to fatigue, you're able to proactively pressure them as well. So even your 0 for 4s that don't have a disruptive on hit, they do present a contract banish that is a pseudo form of disruption to Rangers. So things that had changed from the previous version of this list was I was running Conceal Blade and I was running like a whole bunch of daggers. They take up so much space. Conceal Blade is a pretty poor EV hit. There was a lot of danger with it. So if you drew it early and you wanted to use it, it would force you to use Flick Knives aggressively, like in the first few turns of the game. And if for some reason your opponent was banking a D-React and you overextend with that, they can just blow you out and then you're just stuck on 1 dagger when you could have just kept it anyway. So it was ideal for second cycle when you've already kind of used Flick Knives. As we cut down on sideboard slots, we started basically running only 1 of each dagger. So like in this list, there's no duplicates. So if I run Conceal Blade and I throw a Spider's Bite, I can't go get another Spider's Bite that's relevant for the matchup. I have to go get Scale Peeler, which maybe is useful, but it might not be, right? And just the small concentration of daggers just doesn't make it worth it. But that's pretty much it. The other thing too is just sort of like shuffling around some of the defensive cards, also cutting the other codexes that aren't Frailty. I think there's a build of this deck that doesn't run any pumps, so you can't really miss. And if you're just going to be running 0 for 4s or just 0 cost cards in general, you could be running Codex of Inertia. It could be useful for things like Iceland or Oldhim, even Ranger to some degree. Sideboard plan, looking at what we expect from the Baltimore meta, it's shaping up to mostly be Ranger and Oldhim, some Dromai on the side. Dromai will probably be well represented, maybe won't convert all that well, but regardless, that matchup is pretty much unwinnable for you. There is another contract list that's going out there by Archon Altered, and this list does have some more Dromai tech, so you have things like Hurl and Down and Dirty. Hurl does actually have some use into things like Oldhim, but something like Down and Dirty, for example, I just don't really see a need to run it because I think the matchup's already so unfavored. That's like 2 sideboard slots that could be more relevant cards for matchups that you're trying to prey on. So I'm always a fan of, especially for a deck like this, targeting really hard the matchups you're trying to win and just accepting the polarizing nature of a matchup that's not favored, right? Which is just sort of the illusion of special, is just having polarizing matchups. But I would want to focus more on getting as much edge as possible, for instance, in the Ranger matchup, rather than sacrificing my sideboard to try to make Dromai a little bit more manageable when it's still a losing matchup, even if I sideboard tech really heavily. So that's just my perspective. So that's why I pretty much have like no regard or respect for Dromai in the sideboard. I don't think it's going to happen regardless. You do have a possibility to high roll Dromai if you're kind of being conservative about managing the board state, mostly pressuring them and just having opportunistic times to shut things down with poppers. There's a road to victory there, but it's very very slim, very hard to get to, probably won't pan out in most of your games. But the core style of the list is still there. There's still like a mid-range value style deck that can pivot to be a little bit more aggressive, but also can back foot and be pretty defensive. Having like a floor, being able to block usually 12 is pretty good. Obviously, like we talked about before, you would rather be blocking for, let's say 9, sending a contract, value in the silver at, let's say 0.5 value. So hopefully you get into 0 for 4.5 each turn. And then you can sort of pivot into double contract hands and just play like a really long numbers game. You have a pretty good second cycle, usually with things like isolate, if you're pitch stacking threats. And if you're also pitching codex to effects early, you can have some really good codex late game hands that can normally push most games for you. Depends on the matchup though, because some matchups you do need to play them early just to regain tempo on the board for something like, let's say, Ranger. Other than that, you have some ways to scale larger hands, for instance. So if you have some yellows or a blue and you are forced to keep a 4-card hand to maintain pressure on your opponent, you can pitch it to the daggers. You do have codex, you have some expensive cards like Mana Conquer, you do run Annihilate the Arm, so you do have a 1 for 5. You can also run E-Strike as a chain extender, so you can give a go again into something else. But honestly, E-Strike is probably better off drawing you a blind card, or it is coming in for 7. Going into the sideboard, most of this is geared for Ranger and Oldhim, as this is like what I would expect, and probably what I think the deck works best into. I think right now a Contract Uzuri is a pretty decent mid-range deck, but I think it's mostly best suited to be a tempo style deck that can sort of prey on greedy aggro decks, essentially. Decks that want to arsenal a lot, decks that have pretty fragile hand states, decks that don't want to block, or decks that can lose the overall long course of the game through like poor number trading. So like if there's ever some slower decks that come in the meta that aren't things like hyper defensive like Oldhim, or have like combo potential like Icelander, and Contract Uzuri seems pretty good. It just plays like really old school flesh and blood math with the silver, regenerating a blocking battle-worn equipment. But then you also have the secondary game plan of proactively fatiguing out your opponent. I win most of my games in this deck through pure combat damage. There are some matchups where you just slowly grind out your opponent till they have no more cards left. But the majority of games, despite this being a contract list, is I hit you for 4, I hit you for 4. I have a pivot turn with Codex where I get to send Death Touch. I then get to ponder, probably another 0 for 4 in Arsenal. There's also some insane, I maybe should just make a quick demonstrative video on this, because Razor Reflex is in here for Oldhim, and it's also in here for matchups where you want to disrupt, so like aggro, because you can do some insane stuff with this. So for example, you can go Leave No Witnesses. Let's say your opponent has an arsenal, blocks to preserve it. You can Razor it, give it go again, play like Codex of Frailty, get the Leave No Witnesses back, and then you can kill 2 arsenals in 1 turn. This is even better if they block partially, right? So if they block on the Leave No Witnesses with cards from hand to protect their arsenal, and you Razor this, they lost cards, they lost their arsenal card, you play the Codex, so they have to put a card in the arsenal, and then they have to discard another card from hand, which then means that the Leave No Witnesses is likely to hit. That was a lot of damage as well, right? Because these are all 0 for 4s, Razor's essentially a 1 for 3. So you're also dealing damage to your opponent in the process. And you can have some really good pivot turns as well with Death Touch. So you can go like Death Touch from Arsenal, Razor it, or use Boots on it, Codex, get another one back in. If you're giving Blood Rots, if we're just going to like purely math this out because that's the easiest way to quantify it, then each Death Touch is a 1 for 8. So it sounds all really good, right? Unfortunately, like some of the decks just have better numbers right now. Like if you look at the Rangers, their like output's just so much better. They have disruptive on hits all the time, or really like value generative on hits, so things like Ponders and Heat Seekers that draw cards directly into Arsenal. They also just use Codex of Frailty better than you do, so it's tough, but you do have some options. So that's where I kind of see the contract list going. At least that's where I like to play it at, is this sort of tempo-based game where I'm generating value, being a little bit aggressive while also kind of pivoting back on defense when I need to be. There are matchups where I can proactively fatigue and then start blocking out to preserve life total and let my opponent run out of cards. I also set up really good second cycle pitch stacks with like Razors, any of the shreds, right? Your Codex, all that kind of stuff. So it's very flexible. So targeting this meta, right? You're mostly going to be hitting Rangers. So that's why all of these are in, all these D-Reacts, Oasis, things like that. Oasis can double down in both the Oldhim, Icelander, and Ranger matchup. So it has utility across all 3. The thing now is that since Lexi is on these Fuseless builds that don't run ice cards, you're actually perfectly fine running things like Sync or Fate into them. If they do reveal the flip an ice card in response to the trigger, you can just float your Tunic if you do have Tunic up, and then you can play these without having to pitch an additional card. That's why these are in here. They're also doubling into the Oldhim matchup. And regardless, you run these into most matchups because they're just good value numbers, these 0-for-4s, right? That puts them on par with the contracts. So if you can block with 2 D-Reacts for 8, send 2 contracts with your boots for 8, 16 value is perfectly reasonable, probably something you want to be at. And it's overall a good thing. So they're just here for raw value numbers. Frailty Trap is the trap we're including because we're targeting Ranger right now. Frailty Trap is really, really good against Lexi. It may be less powerful against Azalea unless if she signed up more go white turn, but into Lexi, this is at least a 0-for-6 because you're going to get 3 points of value out of the Frailty. Assuming that it's an average turn and there's only 3 attacks, there's only 3 arrows, you're looking at a 0-for-6. If it's an above average turn and they're going to maybe reload off of Bullseye and Snaps, or they're going to quiver if they're on Wrestling Leaves, then you're looking at a 0-for-7, maybe even more, right? Fantastic card. No reason why you wouldn't want to run it with Lexi right now in the meta. Another really big thing too is that Lexi has to respect this card because if she opens up with Bolden Shot for +1, if she doesn't have Rain Razors and you play Frailty Trap, it applies retroactively and the Bolden Shot loses go again. And so you can literally just time walk her. So if she kept 5 or 6 cards, opens up with Bolden Shot, you go Frailty Trap and she doesn't have a response, her turn's just over. I don't even know if this video is going to come out before the Pro Tour. So this might all be completely irrelevant. We'll see. Oasis is good. You're able to have essentially a 1-for-5 if you have Tunic up, but also in some matchups like Icelander where you're pitching naturally or against Rune Blades, you can cover up Thorn really well and it lets you kind of have a better response to some of their stronger effects. It's also good into Azalea because if she dominates something, it doesn't even matter if you have to pitch from hand because you couldn't block with that card anyway. Razor Reflexes here for your aggro matchups where you're trying to basically disrupt Ranger, for example. I would run this because I'm really trying to push some of the on hits through. I'm also trying to chain multiple effects together that are disruptive. It's also here for Oldhim because you can pitch stack it and then try to set up something that can push over the end. Think is exactly the same as before. Unmovable is here for pretty much Oldhim and Azalea. There's some other niche matchups you can find use in for something like Dorinthia, for example. It's mostly here so you can trade efficiently with Oldhim, not lose too many cards from deck to block 8. You're really worried about the card economy in that matchup a lot of the times. If you block too aggressively, if the Oldhim is being aggressive, you can run out of cards pretty quickly, and this just lets you have a cleaner answer for some of those effects. So if the opponent comes in for 8 with Glacial Infused, at some point the Oldhim, if they're proactively playing well, even the fatigue lists are going to be running things like Sledge of Anvilheim now to always be presenting sick. So even a fatigue deck that's on Sledge puts you on a really fast clock, right? There's only so many non-blocks you can do before you eventually have to start blocking with cards. And even if you're proactively blocking with cards at the whole game, they're pitching cards to present a threat to you. You're not always doing that outside of the bites. The issue there too is that they're just always ripping cards from your deck in a way that's always advantageous for the Oldhim. So you're never going to really beat the Oldhim most of the time on the fatigue plan. Unmovable does help you preserve a little bit more cards in deck, which may be the small edge you need between winning and losing that matchup. Plague is pretty good in the Oldhim matchup. It's seen some experimentation in Lexi. The issue is that sometimes there are Lexi turns where you need to fully block out, and if you're stuck with it, it's a bad time. You'll eat some on hits. The only thing you can do is pitch to dagger. But the thing is that if you're proactively commanding tempo against Lexi, like this card is gas. All 3 modes are active against Lexi. We already talked about Frailty Trap being a 0-for-6 because of the Frailty token. If you give Frailty off Plague Hive, your pitch card turned into 3 additional points at least. Your Blood Rot's equal to 2. Your Inertia is equal to a number that's very nebulous, but you can understand how good it would be into something like Ranger. Plague Hive is pretty decent in Lexi. You can experiment with it a bit, but it is very, very good against Oldhim. Frailty is pretty good if they're on a fatigue plan and they're going to be sending Sledge every turn. Inertia turns off Crown, and Blood Rot's equal to 2 damage, right? And Oldhim, you're going to be drawing this multiple times, and if you get down to that kind of game state where you're just redrawing the same 3 to 4 cards every turn, you're giving them a token every single turn, you're going to get full value out of this thing. So it's pretty good. Is it a make or break for the matchup? I really don't know. Probably not. It's very playable, especially with this current meta. If you have access to it, you should play that card. As we go on the rest of the deck, there's just a 1-up Spreading Plague. This is for just things like Oldhim. You could even go up to 2. I know the Archon Altars list is on that as well. You can present a tall threat late game. So for instance, in this list, you can present E-Strike for 7, CNC for 6, Death Touch for 6, Shakedown for instance. So a card that ideally is going to need to be blocked by 2 to 3 cards, I use Spreading Plague it and just unconditionally present 6 damage to your opponent is very good. So it's pretty nice for Oldhim. Honestly, if you don't have a Plague Hive, you can maybe just swap in a second Spreading Plague. That might be the budget alternative. And then the rest of this is just pretty standard. Run AB3. No need to run 2 daggers and things like Icelander. And then Scale Peeler and Vambrace are here for Oldhim. You might be able to find some matchups where you like Peeler versus Spider's Bite. So for instance, something like Dory, Scalpel and Peeler are good because the Scalpel will, you know, if they're running Shunt or Sink, right, if they're being more defensive into you, but the Peeler makes it so that they can't block with like Courage, because with the Temper, it would just kill it immediately, but also just negates a lot of the value of their armor, which is a really big part of that deck. You can even run it into Runeblade, for example, because they run like Grasp and Crown, like fringe use cases, but it's mostly here for Oldhim. The only issue is that Oldhim is now pivoting off of Rampart and they're moving into Sledge. The reason why is because the Peeler Vambrace tech was so that you could essentially negate their Rampart by attacking with a Peeler, they Crown, and then you Vambrace through the Crown, the Peeler hits, which then means if you follow up with an attack, right, so you play your attack afterwards, whatever it is, they can't, we'll specify the 0 for force. So you play a 0 for 4, threatens like damage and a banish off the top. They can't 3 block plus Rampart anymore because the Rampart has a -1 when it blocks from the Scale Peeler. So at that point, they have to give you 2 cards from hand or let the card hit. So if their goal is to not let your cards hit, Peeler and Vambrace make it pretty difficult. The answer right now has just been that the Oldhims are basically opting to always be sending Sledge every single turn because it slowly proactively fatigues you and makes you eventually have to start blocking with cards, which reduces the ability for you to push some of these effects, right? So if you have less cards in hand, it gets more difficult to Peeler Vambrace and still be able to present a threat. Also upping the Earth count as well as another way to counteract the Vambrace tech, as you can push all this to try to get the dagger to go through, and then they just Earth react, which also pitches and doesn't actually burn cards from deck. So it's pretty difficult, right? Oldhims are adapting. It's a very adaptable deck, and it's very difficult to like find something that like really pinpoints and really counters Oldhim. But I mean, you can still run this if you want. The only consideration now, in my opinion, is that if you believe that all of your local Oldhims or the event you're going to, whatever it is, if you think all the Oldhims are going to be defaulting to Sledge against Uzuri, you could replace this either with another react, so maybe like a Yellow Shred, a Spreading Plague, maybe an Immovable. The other thing you could opt to include in that matchup is actually a Crown of Providence, being able to prevent like an Arsenal disruptive effect, or to be able to filter for a specific card, like if you're going into your pitch cycle and there's like one card you're really trying to find and you know where it is in your deck, but also having 2 block can sometimes be a little bit more advantageous. So like Crown can have some benefit uses. So that's like one example, right? On top of all the others, right? You can include another Razor, Immovable, Shred, Spreading Plague, whatever. And then you could just run Scalpel and Bite into them. But overall, that's the list. Not much has changed, but there are some pretty notable differences, like enough to warrant like even a follow-up video, like an overall understanding of the deck, like what I think it's going to end up looking like. If you do want another version of it, you can go check out Archon Altar's version. It's somewhat similar. There are some differences, right? Like we see Inertia Trap, Down and Dirty, Remembrance, and Yellow Shred. So small tweaks there, but overall kind of the same. So, you know, whatever you prefer, but give it a shot. Let me know what you think of it, what's working, what's not. Hopefully we can maybe come back to it again in some time and see what we can change then. But until next time, thank you for watching.